There is a pattern in history that most superpowers prefer not to examine too closely, because once you see it, it becomes deeply uncomfortable. Again and again, the world's strongest empires have challenged China, not always to conquer it outright, but to dominate it, contain it, or force it into submission. And again, those empires eventually weakened, fractured, or collapsed, not because China defeated them in decisive battles, but because confronting China dragged them into a long, exhausting struggle they could not afford to sustain. From the Mongol Empire to the Manchu rulers, from Imperial Japan to the Soviet Union, from the British Empire to the present day, the outcome followed a familiar trajectory. Each power believed it could control China through military superiority, economic pressure, or strategic intimidation. Each assumed that China would eventually bend, break, or transform to fit their system. Instead, the opposite happened. China endured, absorbed pressure, and outlasted them. This is not a story about invincibility or flawless strategy. It is a story about scale, time, and a civilization structured to survive confrontation rather than win it quickly. And that raises a question that can no longer be avoided. If every superpower that challenged China eventually paid a heavy price, what does that pattern mean today? Is the modern world different enough to escape it, or is the same historical mechanism quietly activating once again? To understand why confronting China has so often ended badly for those who tried, we need to look beyond battles and treaties and examine the deeper forces that turn dominance into exhaustion and ambition into collapse. The first and clearest example of this pattern begins with what looked like one of the most overwhelming victories in human history. In 1279, the Mongol Empire completed its conquest of China, crushing the Song dynasty and bringing the most advanced civilization on Earth under foreign rule for the first time. Militarily, this should have been the end of the story. The Mongols possessed unmatched cavalry, ruthless discipline, and a reputation that broke enemies before battles even began. They had conquered territory stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe, defeating armies that had never lost before. China, by comparison, was divided, exhausted, and vulnerable. Yet the moment the Mongols won, they stepped into a problem they did not understand. Conquering China was easy. Governing it was something else entirely. China was not just land and people. It was an intricate system of taxation, law, infrastructure, irrigation, and bureaucracy refined over centuries. The Mongols were masters of war, not administration. They did not know how to collect taxes from tens of millions of farmers, maintain canals and granaries, or manage a civil service spread across thousands of miles. Faced with this reality, they made a decision that would ultimately destroy their empire from within. They kept China's system intact. They relied on Chinese officials to run the government, adopted Chinese court rituals, and moved their capital into the heart of Chinese civilization. On the surface, this was pragmatic. The empire functioned. Wealth flowed in. Order was maintained. But beneath that stability, something irreversible had begun. To rule China, the Mongols had to operate within Chinese structures, using Chinese language, norms, and expectations. Power no longer flowed from the steppe or the battlefield, but from ministries, tax offices, and written records controlled by people who had been doing this for generations. Slowly, almost invisibly, the conquerors stopped being conquerors. They learned Chinese, lived like Chinese elites, and governed as Chinese emperors. And once that transformation was complete, the Mongols were no longer an external force ruling China. They were simply another Chinese dynasty, subject to the same pressures, rebellions, and cycles of collapse that had ended countless regimes before them. The Mongols did not lose China because they were defeated in war. They lost because ruling China forced them to become what they once conquered, and in doing so, they stepped onto a historical path that almost always ends the same way. If the Mongols represent what happens when conquerors underestimate China's ability to absorb them, the Manchus represent what happens when conquerors understand the danger and still cannot escape it. When Manchu forces crossed the Great Wall in 1644 and seized Beijing, they were fully aware of the fate that had befallen the Mongol rulers centuries earlier. They knew that ruling China meant risking cultural disappearance, and they were determined not to repeat that mistake. From the very beginning of the Qing dynasty, the Manchus tried to draw a clear line between ruler and ruled. They imposed visible markers of dominance, forcing Han Chinese men to shave their foreheads and wear the queue as a sign of submission. They restricted intermarriage, maintained separate military units, and preserved their language within the imperial court. For a time, it seemed as though they had found a way to control China without becoming it. But this separation was largely symbolic because the deeper problem remained unsolved. China could not be governed without Chinese administrators. The empire's scale and complexity demanded a bureaucracy trained in Confucian texts, legal precedent, taxation, and ritual governance. The imperial examination system, which selected officials based on mastery of classical Chinese knowledge, remained indispensable. And so, despite their intentions, the Manchus were forced to rely on the same Confucian scholar officials who had sustained every Chinese dynasty before them. Generation by generation, the Qing court began to change. Emperors studied Chinese classics, wrote poetry in Chinese, and performed traditional rituals to secure legitimacy in the eyes of the population. The Manchu language, once fiercely protected, gradually faded even among the ruling elite. By the 19th century, many members of the imperial family could barely speak it. What had begun as a foreign conquest slowly transformed into a thoroughly Chinese regime in all but name. And once that transformation was complete, the Qing faced the same fate as every dynasty before them. When crisis struck, foreign invasion, internal rebellion, economic strain, the population no longer saw them as invincible outsiders, but as failed rulers who had lost the mandate of heaven. In 1911, the Qing collapsed with stunning speed. The Manchus did not lose China because they failed to resist Chinese culture. They lost because resisting it while trying to govern proved impossible. They became Chinese enough to be overthrown, but never foreign enough to remain untouchable. And this reveals the deeper trap at the heart of Chinese history. Anyone who rules China must become Chinese, and once they do, they inherit not just power, but vulnerability. If ruling China turns conquerors into dynasties destined to fall, then trying to defeat China without ruling it creates an even more dangerous outcome, a war that never truly ends. Imperial Japan learned this lesson at an enormous cost. When Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China in 1937, it believed the outcome was already decided. Japan possessed a modern industrial economy, advanced weaponry, and one of the most disciplined armies in the world. China, by contrast, was fragmented, impoverished, and technologically backward. Japanese forces swept through coastal cities, seized railways and ports, and occupied the most valuable industrial regions within months. On paper, this was a decisive victory, but China did not collapse. Instead, it absorbed the shock and retreated inward. The nationalist government withdrew deep into the interior, moving the capital far beyond Japan's reach, while communist forces dispersed into the countryside and waged relentless guerrilla warfare. Japan could capture cities, but it could not control the land between them. China's vast size, its population spread across mountains, rivers, and rural networks, turned occupation into a logistical nightmare. Every supply line had to be guarded, every garrison reinforced, every advance paid for in manpower and resources. The longer the war dragged on, the more Japan had to commit simply to maintain what it had already taken. Victory demanded constant escalation, not resolution. Over 8 years, China became a drain on Japan's economy, its military, and its political stability. Soldiers died not only in combat, but from disease, exhaustion, and endless counterinsurgency. At home, the Japanese economy strained under the cost of sustaining an occupation that produced no final outcome. Desperation drove Japan to expand elsewhere, seeking resources in Southeast Asia, a move that triggered direct confrontation with Western powers and dragged Japan into a wider war it could not win. By 1945, Japan was defeated, not because China outmatched it militarily, but because China refused to break. The invasion of China did not destroy China. It destroyed Japan's ability to sustain itself. This is the second mechanism in the pattern. China does not need to defeat its adversaries in battle. It only needs to force them into a struggle where time, scale, and endurance work against them. And once an empire commits itself to such a contest, the cost continues to rise until collapse becomes inevitable. The Soviet Union offers a different version of the same trap, one that does not involve invasion or occupation, but confrontation through sheer military pressure. In 1969, tensions between Soviet Union and China erupted into armed clashes along the Ussuri River, shattering the illusion of unity within the communist world. These were not large battles, but they were psychologically explosive. China had nuclear weapons, the world's largest standing army, and a political system that had just survived years of internal chaos. To Soviet planners, China suddenly looked less like a junior partner and more like an unpredictable existential threat. Moscow responded not with diplomacy, but with escalation. Over the following years, the Soviets stationed more than 1 million troops along China's border, backed by tanks, aircraft, and missile systems, preparing for a war that might never come. This massive buildup happened while the Soviet Union was already locked in an arms race with NATO, maintaining control over Eastern Europe, and fighting a costly war in Afghanistan. The economic burden was staggering. Defense spending consumed a huge share of Soviet resources, diverting investment away from civilian industry, infrastructure, and consumer goods. Living standards stagnated, productivity lagged, public dissatisfaction grew. And yet, China did nothing dramatic in response. It did not launch an invasion. It did not provoke full-scale war. It simply existed as a permanent, unresolved threat that forced the Soviets to keep spending, year after year, with no clear endpoint. This is the essence of the Chinese strategic advantage in this context. China did not need to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. It only needed to be large, resilient, and impossible to neutralize. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was exhausted, strained by decades of overextension on multiple fronts. When the system finally collapsed in 1991, the arms race with the United States received most of the blame. But that explanation misses a crucial factor. The Soviet Union was fighting a two-front competition, and the Eastern Front, the one facing China, quietly drained resources just as relentlessly. China did not cause the Soviet collapse on its own, but it amplified every structural weakness in the system. Once again, China did not win by attacking. It won by forcing a rival to commit to an unsustainable level of pressure, proving that even without conquest or war, challenging China directly can become a slow, irreversible act of self-destruction. The British Empire demonstrates the final and perhaps most deceptive version of this pattern, because Britain did not try to conquer China completely, nor did it prepare for endless war on land. Instead, it pursued domination through trade, naval power, and selective control, and for a time, it appeared to succeed. In the 19th century, Britain forced China open through the Opium Wars, imposed unequal treaties, seized Hong Kong, and established control over key ports and trade routes. Militarily and diplomatically, China was humiliated. From a Western perspective, this looked like a decisive victory. But Britain never truly ruled China, and that was the problem. To maintain influence, Britain had to keep warships in Asian waters, garrisons in strategic locations, and administrators overseeing trade networks that stretched across the globe. China itself was too large, too complex, and too resistant to be transformed into a profitable colony like India. The wealth extracted from China never matched the cost of maintaining dominance over it. Instead of becoming an asset, China became a long-term financial drain. This burden was manageable when Britain was at the height of its power, but it became catastrophic once global conditions changed. 2 world wars shattered Britain's economy, forcing massive borrowing and accelerating imperial decline. Maintaining far-flung commitments no longer made sense, and colonies that once symbolized power became liabilities. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire unraveled with remarkable speed. One by one, its possessions gained independence. In 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China, closing the final chapter of Britain's confrontation with a civilization it had once dominated. Britain had won battles, imposed treaties, and dictated terms, yet China endured long enough for the balance of power to reverse. This reveals the most dangerous illusion of all. Defeating China does not mean controlling it, and controlling parts of China does not mean benefiting from it. Partial dominance locks rivals into a costly holding pattern, one that demands constant expenditure without offering decisive resolution. Britain did not fall because China defeated it directly. Britain fell because maintaining power over China contributed to a broader pattern of overextension that the empire could not survive. And this brings the story to its most uncomfortable point, because the mechanisms that drained Britain's strength are not relics of the past. They are structural realities that still apply to any power that commits itself to an open-ended competition with China, setting the stage for a question that now confronts the modern world. Taken together, these cases reveal a pattern that is uncomfortable precisely because it does not rely on dramatic battles or sudden collapse. The Mongols conquered China and disappeared. The Manchus ruled China and became Chinese. Japan invaded China and exhausted itself. The Soviet Union confronted China and bled resources until its system gave way. Britain humiliated China and still declined under the weight of global overextension. In each case, China did not need to deliver a final blow. It only needed to remain intact long enough for the challenger's own commitments to become unsustainable. This is why China has so often been misread. Power is usually measured by how quickly an enemy can be defeated. China's power operates on a different timeline. It stretches conflicts, magnifies costs, and turns dominance into burden. That does not mean China is destined to win every confrontation, or that its system is without flaws. It means that competing with China is not a short-term contest of strength, but a long-term test of endurance, cohesion, and economic discipline. And this is where the modern world enters uncertain territory. The United States is not the Mongol Empire, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union, or the British Empire. It has allies, technological advantages, and a resilient economy. But it is also deeply committed to maintaining global presence, military readiness, and economic influence in a world where China is too large to isolate, too integrated to ignore, and too resilient to force into submission. History does not repeat itself mechanically, but it does apply pressure in familiar ways. The question is no longer whether China will collapse under external challenge, because history suggests that outcome is unlikely. The real question is whether today's superpowers can compete with China without repeating the same cycle of exhaustion that claimed every challenger before them. And that answer will not be decided by who wins the next confrontation, but by who can afford to remain in the contest the longest.